Sorry I ran out. I'm both tech and worship associate today, and I forgot to start the recording. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Oxford. My name is Andrew Fringer. I will be your worship associate today. If this is your first time here or your 101st time, we are very glad that you are here. If you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, or you entered through the doors with a song in your heart and a skip in your step, we're glad you're here. If you're the loudest voice in the town square or the subtle hand behind the scenes, we're still glad you're here. And if you have failed once or failed 1,000 times, we're glad you're here. If you sing like angels or mumble behind the hymnal or just do the best you can, we're glad you're here. This community is what it is because of your presence. So welcome. Welcome into this space of love and support, justice, compassion, fellowship, and worship. We are glad that you are here. As you know, the mission of UUCO is to provide a caring, intergenerational community that fosters spiritual growth through free thought and discussion with respect for personal belief. We seek the wisdom of many religious traditions and of ourselves. We celebrate diversity, and we encourage the expression of personal ideals in service to people, other life, and our planet. We're a congregation in which lay people like me share the leadership of our services as we share that with our halftime minister, Reverend Sarah Osborne. If you're interested in getting involved at all in our services, even if it's just lighting the chalice or reading occasionally, please reach out to me or reach out to James Bowker, our Sunday service chair, or anyone on the board. We would love to have more people involved. Announcements. We have the Boo at the UU Halloween party coming up on October 26th. There's a little flyer up here that looks quite nice. Wendy, is there anything you want to say about this? I assume you're involved with it.
I expect full participation from all ages. I don't care who you are, you're pledged. Prizes are available.
So that's going to be on October 26th at 11:30 a.m. right after the service. There will be games, prizes, snacks, and stuff for all ages. And if Wendy's involved, it's usually pretty decent in my experience.
Are costumes required?
What's that?
Are costumes required?
Optional.
Costumes
Yeah,
optional.
recommended.
Strongly encouraged.
Strongly encouraged.
You can come as a free thinker.
That is terrifying.
It is terrifying in this day and age, yes. Yeah. We also have our annual UUCO fundraiser silent auction coming up. That is going to be taking place on November 16th. We'll be distributing some more information about that soon, very, very soon. But start thinking about if you'd like to contribute a good, a service, an event, or anything like that. We have circulated through email like a sign-up form for events, so please look in your email for that. It would have been in both the weekly announcement, but also a separate email that should have gone out. So let me know if you haven't got that. Anything else? The adult series of OWL. We have the OWL program starting up. When is that, Wendy? It is last Sundays of the month, right?
Yep.
Last Sundays of the month. If you're interested in that, either see Wendy or email Reverend Sarah. Obviously, information is available to you in the announcements here. Let me see if there's anything else. I think that's all the announcements for us. Am I missing anything that anyone knows of? All right, very good. Today we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Miguel Centellas. In addition to being my neighbor, Miguel Centellas teaches sociology at the University of Mississippi. His academic training is in political science. He's got interests in democratic theory and practice, which is quite timely and probably very frustrating for you at times. In addition, Miguel serves as a board member of the ACLU of Mississippi and was scoutmaster for Scouting America Troop 144 here in Oxford. He's also a husband and a father of 3 wonderful children. So please join me in welcoming Miguel. And Miguel, will you do our call to worship?
Sure. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy.
Thank you. I think you can stay up here. We're going to do, we're doing Greet Your Neighbor, sorry. You'll be back in a moment. Now it's time in our service where we greet one another. As a gesture of holy hospitality, we invite you to share a moment with the folks around you. Say good morning, extend a hand in peace, offer a hug or perhaps a word. And as a practice of consent, if you don't wish to participate in this, you can put your hand over your heart and we will honor your choice. Now please turn to the person on your right or your left and briefly greet your neighbor. Okay. All right, you can come on back up, Miguel. And for this. Yep, exactly. Our chalice lighting today comes from Tracy Johnson. We kindle our chalice flame this morning, awakening the fire of our ancestors in our hearts. Beacon of freedom held out to light the way, light of reason illuminating the path, spark of courage igniting our spirits, aglow with hope for all we endeavor to do together. Holy flame of times past, brighten this present moment, that we may be the love that is our center and our foundation both. Blessed be.
Miguel, apaga. You get you to work today.
Now please again rise in body or spirit as we sing community hymn number 1028 in the teal hymnal this time, Fire of Commitment. Okay. Any words for us before we start, Tycho?
You know, it's a weird time, but it's not that hard. There's an intro. It should be, I think you guys can just get right into it. It's 3 verses.
share our story for all ages.
Okay. I have a wonder box. I need somebody to open it for me. Tell me what's inside. Can someone open it? Wonderful. Oh, there's something.
It looks like a teeny tiny itty bitty crown.
It is a tiny crown. Thank you, Joanne. Appreciate that. All right. So today we have another story of another emperor. You may remember a few weeks ago we did a story about an emperor and a nightingale. Before we begin our story, we're going to begin our practice of I say story time, you say story time, okay? Story time? Story time! Wow, it's like twice the people are in here today. Good job, y'all. Once upon a time, there was an emperor, and this emperor didn't care much for his job, but he did like one aspect of it. He loved to dress in great finery. He could not have enough fine clothes, this emperor. And so he spent much of his time acquiring new cloth, hiring new tailors, finding new seamstresses, finding new ways to produce fabrics, and all so he could look lovely. Well, one day it came to his ear that in the town there were 2 new weavers, and these men were experts in the weaving of the finest cloth in all the world, and of course the emperor knew I must have an entire suit made by these men. So he sent for them, and they came and they explained to him exactly how they did their craft, and they explained all the things they need, gold and thread and fine fabrics and fine dyes from all over the world, and in the end it would feel as light as a cobweb when he wore it, and it would be so exquisite that only those who were worthy of their offices could see this fabric. Well, he thought that would be fine indeed, and it's useful. It's a good investment. I'll be able to tell who's worthy around me. I like this very much. So he ordered an entire suit, and he told them he would give them all the resources they would need. Now, as the 2 men were leaving, there was a maid in the hall, and she watched how they changed as they walked down the hall. They weren't speaking the way they had spoken to the emperor. They seemed a little different to her, and she thought, there's something I don't like about them. There's something I don't trust. But she didn't say anything because she thought that might lead to an argument or a conflict. I don't want to do that. So she kept quiet, this maid. What do I know anyway, she thought. Well, these men went out. They were given the full resources. They were told they could hire themselves the very best tailors, the very best weavers. Anyone they needed to work for them must work for them in the kingdom or in the empire and be at their service, however they wished. And they could have all the resources. So they began work. And the emperor thought, oh good, I can't wait. I want to go see how they're doing. But he thought, what if I go and I'm not worthy? What if I don't see the cloth? And he thought, I know, I'll send my head seamstress. She's excellent. She'll go. And that way I don't have to run the risk that I haven't seen what I should have seen. So he sent his seamstress. She was very, very good at her work. And she went and she looked and she saw nothing. There was nothing that she could see in that workshop. And she thought, oh no, maybe I'm not as good as I thought at my job. And she also noticed some other things. She noticed that the people he had sent, or that they had employed, were working very hard, and they were not getting paid enough, and they were very stressed out, and they didn't seem to be doing things that they thought were worthy. The tailors were just snipping thread, the weavers were sweeping the floors. It all seemed crazy and wrong to her, and she had a strong sense of justice, so she wanted to speak out and say, treat these people better, pay them what they're worth, give them good work. But she thought, I might lose my job if I do that. So she went back to the emperor and she said, everything's fine, everything's coming along well, they haven't woven the cloth yet, but they're building the looms, everything looks great, it's going to be amazing. So the emperor said, great. And then he said, I want to know how they're doing this. I want to know the science behind it. I want to know the technology. And I also want to know that things are making progress. I'm so excited. So he sent his most intelligent engineer to look. And he thought, and if he can't see the cloth, then I'll know he's not worthy of his job. Well, the engineer went, and what he saw was 2 great looms set up, and those 2 men were working at them very hard, but there was no fabric to be seen. And the engineer thought, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought. Maybe I'm not as good at this work as I thought. But if I go back and tell the emperor, he'll think I'm not smart enough for this work anymore. So he went back and he just told the emperor, it looks great, it's fantastic, that technology's amazing. And he made up some stuff to tell the emperor. It sounded really smart when he said it. And the emperor said, great. Finally, the emperor said, it's almost done. I'm going to send my brother to look at it. Because my brother, honestly, he's richer than I am. But I don't let him feel that. I don't tell him that. I don't admit it to him. But he's richer. He's more successful. He's done better than I have. And he will know if the fabric is truly good quality. Because my brother always knows good quality when he sees it. So he sent his younger brother. And his brother went. And he looked. And he too saw nothing. And he went back to the emperor. And he said, it looks great. Because he didn't want to admit to his older brother that he was not worthy. And so the two men came. The day had arrived. They brought the clothing, the well-tailored, amazing clothing, and the emperor was to wear it in a procession. And they dressed it on him, and he admired himself in the mirror, and he admired how fine and light it was. He couldn't even feel it. And he wasn't about to tell anyone that he could not see this fabric on himself when he looked in the mirror. And he got his two chamberlains, two grown men with cherubic faces, and he said, carry my robes. The train is very long. I'm going to need your help as I walk through the city. And they did as he said. They couldn't see anything. They couldn't feel anything, but they picked it up all the same. And they followed him out, and through the streets he went. And the crowd was kind of sparse and looked a little bored that day. But as the emperor walked by, they all applauded and said, oh, you're magnificent, you look wonderful, because no one in the crowd wanted to admit that they couldn't see the clothing. And finally, one little child said, but he's naked, he doesn't have any clothes on. And then the adults began to whisper, he's naked, is he naked? Does he not have clothes on? But the emperor, hearing this, thought, well, I must go on anyway. And he continued on down the street, and his chamberlains continued, holding in their empty hands nothing. And that's the story of the emperor's new clothes. Where do you see yourselves in this story? Story time.
Story time.
And thank you. No.
Thank you, Wendy. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that story has a point to it. Maybe it's still relevant.
Huge point.
Huge point.
Huge. Yeah.
Huge. Please join me now in responsive reading number 592 in the gray hymnals. 592, The Free Mind. I call that mind free which masters the senses and which recognizes its own reality and greatness, which passes life, not in asking what it shall eat or drink, but in hungering, thirsting, and seeking after righteousness. I call that mind free which jealously guards its intellectual rights and powers, which does not content itself with a passive or hereditary faith, which opens itself to light whensoever it may come, which receives new truth as an angel from heaven. I call that mind free which is not passively framed by outward circumstances and is not the creature of accidental impulse, which discovers everywhere the radiant signatures of the infinite spirit, and in them finds help to its own spiritual enlargement. I call that mind free which protects itself against the usurpations of society and which does not cower to human opinion, which refuses to be the slave or tool of the many or of the few, and guards its empire over itself as nobler than the empire of the world. I call that mind free which resists the bondage of habit, which does not mechanically copy the past, not live on its old virtues, but which listens for new and higher emotions and rejoices pour itself forth in fresh and higher exertions. I call that mind free, which sets no bounds to its love, which, wherever they are seen, delights in virtue and sympathizes with suffering. Which recognizes in all human beings the image of God and the rights of God's children, and offers itself up a willing sacrifice to the cause of humankind. I call that mind free, which has cast off all fear but that of wrongdoing, and which no menace or peril can enthrall. Which is calm in the midst of storms, and possesses itself, though all else be lost. William Ellery Channing. Now we will accept our weekly offering. Our collection is split, with half going to our monthly Share the Plate designee and half going to support the mission of UUCO. Our Share the Plate recipient for this month is El Pueblo. El Pueblo works with and for low-income immigrants across Mississippi to provide services that empower immigrants to live lives of dignity and hope. And now it's time to receive that offering. Please give generously if you are able. And if you want to fill out one of our grief, gratitude, and growth cards, they're in the baskets. Give me a moment to collect these. Oh, that's a good one. I'll save that for last. All right. Miguel, if you'll come up, please. And now a ritual to share what is in our hearts and lay it at the altar of community and spirit. Using a pebble dropped into a bowl of water to symbolize the ripple effect of the events of our lives upon the larger community, we will now share the grief, gratitude, and growth moments that have touched our lives since last we were together. Our first pebble is one for joy. It is for our visitors and friends. We offer you a warm welcome. We're happy to have you here today. Miguel, you're a guest, so that's for you and anyone else here. We'll now share the written words of our joys and concerns. Gail Stratton writes that on Monday, October 20th, Marge Holland will have open heart surgery. Please send good energy and prayer for her and for Hannah. We'll set up a meal, looks like it says meal train, later in the week. So contact Gail if you are interested in helping out with that. From Michelle Harvey, a gratitude. My husband Don and I are filled with gratitude as we gain, look how old, I'm getting older. You see me holding this farther away from myself? Back in the day, I could just read them. My husband Don and I are filled with gratitude as we gained a new daughter-in-law last weekend, visited with family and friends who gathered from across the country for our son's wedding, and we enjoyed the beautiful weather as well. It's really nice. Congrats. From Mary Cahan, a gratitude. Michael Leon had 2 heart stents implanted last week. The weather is gorgeous, puffy clouds and blue skies again. Something about, and green trees. There's green trees. Against green trees to view on the way here. Yeah, may the government grow in compassion. True. And from Sue, James and Jordan were married yesterday. James Bowker and Jordan. So if they were married yesterday, why aren't they here today? I guess is the question. Priorities. And finally, we're going to drop a pebble into the water for all the grief, gratitude, and growth moments get up here, Miguel, that remain unspoken. All that we hold in our hearts for ourselves, for each other, and for the world is held in the community and by a love that is limitless. Amen and blessed be. Now you're free, Miguel. Thank you. We have one reading for today. It's a little lengthy, but also timely. It's from a statement by the Unitarian Universalist Association called A Faithful Defiance of Authoritarianism, a Call to Action, Reaffirming Our Covenant for Democracy and Freedom. It's a very UU title. It's kind of long. It was released on September 12th, 2025, and there are full copies on the little table right there as you leave if you want to pick one up. Because the flaming chalice, the living symbol of contemporary Unitarian Universalism, recalls the compassion and strength needed to aid Jewish refugees on the eve of World War II, and has come to represent helpfulness, sacrifice, and enduring faith in action. Because as Unitarian Universalists, we bind ourselves to one another through covenants, sacred promises made in response to the profound gift of life held as shared care and mutual accountability, long central to religious communities and born with reverence and holy aspirations through the spiritual discipline of love. Because in this commitment we walk paths once taken by those who, from the earliest days of this great and troubled republic, pledged themselves to liberty. A liberty not of unbounded freedom, but of responsibility, freely embraced. The necessary constraint of just law, a moral check against abuse of power, and the civic work to sustain fragile institutions. Because this is no ordinary moment, but a time that tries the soul, a time that calls us to reaffirm the values that we, as a faith, have declared our own, holding fast to justice, through which we dismantle racism and the systemic oppression, inclusive democracy, and the dream is the dream of fully accessible, radically inclusive communities where all may flourish. Whereas drawing the circle wider requires a covenant of more profound love that reaches toward the impossible possibility to love our neighbors as ourselves, to cherish the frailty and dignity of our shared humanity, and to act not from outrage or self-righteousness, but from hope tempered by courage and deepened by conviction. Whereas the pillars of justice, equity, democracy, and the rule of law are under siege from authoritarian assaults on the justice system and constitutional protections to the erosion of due process, freedom of speech and press, and the values of diversity and inclusion, from the unlawful deportation of immigrants to the weaponization of state power to silence dissent. Whereas autocratic actors are wielding institutions like the Department of Justice, law enforcement, and the IRS, and federal contracting, not for the common good, but to intimidate and punish their political opponents and ideological challengers. Whereas the corrosion of democracy is fueled by dark money and autocratic actors seeking secret advantage, the enrichment of officials and special interests at the public's expense, and the dismantling of independent oversight and capacity for community accountability. Therefore, be it resolved that we, the 2025 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, call upon the UUA, its member congregation and congregants as appropriate to cast off the cloak of isolation and transcend our differences, both within and beyond ourselves, to defend the guarantees of just law, constitutional integrity, equal justice, meaningful separation of powers, due process, and the freedoms of speech, press, and assembly, by nonviolent civil society action, including our vocal support and exercise of these guarantees and our witness, legislative advocacy, and judicial action, including our support of impactful litigation. Take bold action, activating our faith not only to resist, but also to build a nation that honors the dignity, needs, and values of all its people, one where the beloved community may thrive. And in that spirit, I would like to invite our guest speaker, Miguel Centellas.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Yep.
All right, so before I begin, I do say that I feel obligated to say that I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer. or the state, or any other entities for which I might work for. These are my own words, not theirs. Let's get used to hearing that very often. So I thought I would be a bit of a downer today, but apparently not. That's good. I'm glad you guys are briefed. A very kind of brief introduction to myself, although Andy did a really great job. So yes, I am a political scientist by training, and very specifically, beyond sort of democracy and democratic theory, my research, I'm a comparativist who studied Latin America. And so for much of that cohort of folks, I was the second wave. So the first wave of that group of political scientists would have studied kind of the decay of authoritarian regimes, military dictatorships in Latin America, and there was this huge literature on democratic transitions, how they work, sometimes they don't work, why don't they work? And so the second wave that I came into was one that was interested in democratic consolidation, right? Under what conditions, what kind of institutional frameworks did countries that had recently become democracies, and not just in Latin America, but also post-communist Europe and in a few other places, South Korea, for example, Taiwan, what allowed them to become sustaining democracies. So that's where I kind of grew up, and as a graduate student, sort of my work, etc. By the time I was wrapping up graduate school, about halfway through, there was an election in Venezuela. And this began this interesting Venezuela was a consolidated democracy by all accounts. It had not had a military dictatorship since the 50s. But over time, Venezuela's government under Hugo Chavez deteriorated. And this is where my talk to you tonight comes in, or this morning comes in. So one of these sort of like the top scholars, the one that everyone looked up to, when he was in graduate school at Harvard, he wrote a paper that became required reading for graduate students in my program, and many, many others. So this is the guy, right? Stephen Levitsky. And he coined this term, competitive authoritarianism, that what was happening in Venezuela was a regime that had sort of transitioned in the opposite direction, right? So there was another political scientist named Guillermo O'Donnell who had talked about sort of these transitional regimes, like Argentina in particular, where he was from, that became democracies, but not quite, right? That they were what he called delegative democracies. Democracies with sort of strong presidents who did what they wanted to do and kind of manipulated the system. What Stephen Levitsky suggested was that Venezuela was not that. That Venezuela was not a type of diminished democracy. It was a type of authoritarian regime with democratic characteristics, right? So it still had elections, but the elections didn't really matter much. It still had courts, but the courts tended to be subdued by the executive. It still had a federal structure. Venezuela was a federal system, but it could be attacked kind of by the executive, by targeting specific governors or mayors or things like that. And that made it very, very different. In the time since Levitsky coined that term, you now see other ones like in Hungary, in Turkey, etc., that I have classified as that. The bad news is, and I won't save it for last, we don't yet have any examples of a competitive authoritarian regime that has ever transitioned back. We have lots of examples of authoritarian regimes or post-authoritarian regimes like former Soviet Union that were always authoritarian and then eventually kind of drifted towards a democratic camp by activism and a number of other things. But we don't have a case of that. The one exception, oddly enough, I just sort of, as I thought about it for this week, is the country that I normally studied, which is Bolivia. But we don't know yet. They just had an election where an opposition party won, and we don't know what's going to happen, right? Will it be respected? Will the opposition become a revanchist kind of opposition? We don't know. Which could, So, what is a competitive authoritarian regimes? And one of the things that has to do with free speech is that they maintain their appearance of free speech while systematically undermining it, right? So one thing they do, for example, is grant spaces for free speech. And it's important to use those spaces, right? But being aware. Like, for example, I interestingly noticed yesterday that we were allowed to gather, but not to march. And that was the first time I'd ever been in that space where those two things happened. You can gather, but not march, right? And so having these sort of venting, these spaces where people can vent, but it doesn't actually do a whole lot if you really think about it, right? But it adds pressure, but it doesn't have a lot of impact. in a direct kind of sense. And it also legitimates the regime, right? So the regime can say, look, we allow people to protest, right? We allow them to march. But then on top of that, because there are legal restrictions, you end up having these sort of vague enforcements, right? So I felt obligated to say what I did at the beginning, which, by the way, could also be called malicious compliance, which is a form of resistance, right? Because people on this campus and elsewhere have been fired for things that they have posted on social media or said in private conversations, right? So having this sort of need to always be careful about what you say, while other people maybe don't, right? They are allowed to exercise their free speech and be offensive to others because they are saying the things that the emperor wants to hear, right? I thought that, right? That's sort of the yes men mentality of how emperors operate, right? So competitive authoritarian regimes are in many ways almost like sultanistic regimes, which is another regime type, where it's all about the yes men, right, to the emperor, while maintaining these sort of fringe things. You also have things like media capture, which is a common thing that happens in competitive authoritarian regimes, where the state will rescind or threaten to rescind licenses to broadcasters, shut down networks, or have its cronies and friends purchase other types of communication networks in order to maintain the appearance of having multiple newspapers, but many of them are actually heavily controlled by friends of the state or the state indirectly itself. You also start seeing things like digital authoritarianism, right? So you have, this is things that happened in the late 90s at the early stages of Facebook and Twitter in Venezuela and then elsewhere, right? Trolling, right? You have people or bots that are deliberately trying to get people to say things and get angry and rile people up. You also have using it as a way to give you space, but also figure out who you are, right? And you start seeing like the tracking of people's Twitter accounts, tracking of people's Facebook accounts that can become then a way where you have freedom of speech, and then you, as you exercise it, you run this additional risk. And then of course you also have self-censorship, that because of all of these things, people decide to stop saying the kinds of things that they would want to say. So that all sounds Greek, right? Okay, so what can be done? So there are spaces for resistance in these regimes, and they have been successful in achieving, sort of some goals. So one thing that is important to use is to rely heavily on what's called digital activism. So citizen journalism, right? So the thing that people do now, it's almost like it happens intuitively, right? You see something bad happening, you see police committing an injustice, you pull out your phone and you start recording, and you go live and you post it out there, right? And so that information gets out because the major networks, the major news are simply not going to cover it or be able to cover it for lots of little reasons. There was just a story I just woke up to today that a student newspaper in Indiana, I think it's Indiana University, was shut down because its latest edition was going to criticize the administration of the university, right? And so Purdue University published their paper for them, which was interesting, right? So these acts of sort of like cross-solidarity become very important. Another thing you can do with digital is learning how to leverage and kind of think about those algorithms, right? So I've made it a practice that, I know it means nothing, it does nothing, but every time I see a post on Facebook that I agree with, I just hit like, hit like, hit like. Even if I don't share, I'm feeding the algorithm, right? I'm making it more likely that people will see it. There's also the use of humor and satire, right? Frogs together strong, right? If you know what I mean. Right, so if you were there yesterday, you saw people in unicorn inflatable things. You saw, right, so that kind of use of humor or satire is often more difficult to attack, although the recent attacks here on Jimmy Kimmel and others kind of are making me question that. But historically in Latin America, satirists were given a lot more free rein, right, or even in Russia, to criticize the executive because they're just comedians, right? They're just being funny. Right? It's not really serious. But if you know anything about comedy, you know that comedians are probably some of the greatest philosophers that we have in our society, right? They're really, really bright. And they're often, you have to have a certain amount of intelligence to understand jokes. And censors are typically not very intelligent, especially nowadays when they're using it, right? So an example I gave is a friend of mine who is a math professor, recently had a grant of his pulled, because of all of the politics about this, because as a math research, he was researching inequality, and he was researching how to avoid bias in estimation, right? So bias and inequality, and the transformative number of property of numbers, so trans, right? So clearly someone was using PDF, right? Or someone was just using, Control F on a PDF and flagged that a certain number of things hit, so grant canceled, set for review, right? He'll probably get his money in the end, but in the meantime, one of his graduate students is no longer returning to the United States and is going to stay overseas, right? So there are these consequences, right, that begin to happen. I mentioned before, transnational solidarity, I think, becomes very important. If you have friends overseas, kind of, sometimes that's the only news that they can get. This is a common strategy that happened in Latin America, right? So you had lots of people in Latin America have diasporic communities, and so they knew that their relatives in New York, right, in DC, in London, or in other Latin American countries were not able to get real news, and so they relied on their cousins, right, their friends, like sending them, here's what's really happening, here's what's really happening, here's what's really happening, so that those folks can then kind of spread the news elsewhere, right? So not everything digital can be shut down, particularly, and I highly recommend this to everybody, you need to get an encrypted app. So I'm on Signal, I'm also on WhatsApp, although WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, so take that with a grain of salt. And there are other things too. So if you have the ability, particularly for some kinds of conversations, you want to shift them over into encrypted apps. So that is another thing that we sort of learned from the Latin American experience, is you have kind of multi-tracks, right? Everyone that I know in Latin America has a Facebook account, and everyone has a Twitter account, and everyone has a WhatsApp account, and everyone has some sort of other encrypted account. And those things are used for different purposes to communicate in different kinds of ways, right? So take that for that. Document abuses is an important thing, even if they're not able to be seen right away, just keeping track of those things, adding them up. And then the biggest one is normalize micro acts of dissent. So these little tiny acts, in the business world they call it malicious compliance, right? The little tiny ways of just like, yep, I will do exactly what you told me to do, and then I'm done, right? There's not an additional bit of effort that I need to do. Those kinds of things can become really, really significant. And encouraging and normalizing trivial acts of disagreement, right? So, for example, just wearing a t-shirt with a rainbow on it, right? You're just walking around. You're not saying anything, you're not yelling anything, but like if you begin to normalize the idea that it's okay to not say no, or give grist to mill of memes, right? Like, do you guys know what I mean by frog together strong? Okay, so like just wearing a frog on your t-shirt, wearing Kermit, like it starts to build into that. Some of you don't know what I mean, right? I'm happy to explain.
I just didn't understand what you said.
Frogs together strong?
Oh, frogs together strong?
Yes.
What?
So in Portland, some of the protesters began gathering in inflatable costumes and just standing there and dancing, right, in their inflatable costumes, right? So, it's very difficult to attack them. They're not doing anything deliberately harmful. They're not yelling at the agents. But the one famous one was wearing a frog costume. And so then the memes began to spread. I don't know why they chose him, because there were also unicorns, and there were also panda bears, and there were also all kinds of other creatures. But
Frogs are referenced in the
Exodus.
warning. I don't know about that.
Yes, in Exodus, right? Like the plague of frogs on is that what it was?
Well, that's one of the plagues.
That's one of the memes that came up too about that, yeah.
The frogs are the ones that are put into hot water, and the
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
rises little by little until
Yeah.
they're boiled to death. If you put them in the hot water all at once, they jump out.
Right.
So the frogs
Okay.
symbolize
Yeah.
we're not standing for this.
See, so it works on so many levels, and I hadn't thought of it. I was thinking of Planet of the Apes, right? Apes together strong, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the most recent Planet of the Apes actually subverts the trope and argues that they should have revolted, right? But anyways.
I saw a picture of Oregon, I think in Oregon,
Yeah.
there were a whole bunch of them.
Yes, they begun gathering. Yes, so it's a plague, yeah.
See, and we're talking about it, so it works.
There you go, exactly. So little things like that become in many ways silly, but they make it harder. And to be more bleak, for example, I was talking to a student not of mine, but just a person who was a student at the university at the protest. He's like, oh yeah, there's a lot of old folks here. And I was like, yes, it's harder to gas them.
Oh, it's hard to what?
To gas them.
Gas.
Right, so a common tactic in these kind of protests, very similar to the civil rights movement, is you put the elder people up front. It's really hard for security forces to begin shooting at a bunch of grandmothers, right? That's how Lech Walesa and then the Soviet Union, like that's how they toppled the communist regimes in the end. It was when babushkas came out, right? Think about the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, right? So like for me, like I was comforted. Yeah, we're not gonna get gassed. There's a bunch of grandmas in the crowd. It's good. If there was a bunch of young people with masks and screaming things and ready for like riot, equipment, which there are people that that do, right? So like I have a gas mask in my car and stuff like that. Then I would have been more worried. Like they might start gassing us, right? They might start hitting us with rubber bullets. But so thinking about those things work. So playing the long game, right? That protests are long campaigns. You're not going to get successful flash overthrows of a regime. Typically, the only way those are successful if there's a lot of violence involved, right? So that involves military cooperation, right? So you could have, like in Portugal in 1972, the captain's coup, which is very, very famous, or you can have other kinds of things. You could have, like what happened in Bolivia in 1952, where civilians went out to the streets, like my grandmother, and fought the army for 3 days and defeated them. But other than that, unless you're willing to like really bring out maximum force, right? You're not. Like, it doesn't matter if it's 1 million people in DC or 10 million people in DC, you're gonna have to do it again and again, right? The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King had 1 million people in DC, and it still took another year to get the Civil Rights Act passed, right? Like, these are long campaigns. We often focus on like the big moment when we need to think about the other things. Choosing framing carefully is another important one. So giving opposition no excuse to label you as anti-national. So I love that the organizers knew that, right? Like, let's have lots of American flags, let's have lots of sort of patriotic, like, Statue of Liberty, things that are positive, that it's hard, right, to start shooting at people who are carrying your own flag. It's a lot easier if they're carrying Palestinian flags, right, or things like that. So regardless of what you think about that issue, like, you just know, like, how it's gonna be perceived by others. Using simple but neutral protest language, like we want fair elections, right? Keep it super simple. Like if you start adding all kinds of things about other issues, it gets difficult and it creates division, right? That the groups that might have different ideas. We want dignity, right? Like who doesn't want dignity, right? Like it's hard to shoot a bunch of people who are saying we just want dignity, right? It's easier to shoot people if you're like, I end the genocide in this place, or I say, well, I disagree with your politics, but like everyone wants dignity, right? We want truth, right? Who doesn't want truth, right? So those kinds of strategies are used because in authoritarian regimes, in competitive authoritarian regimes, the military, the police are still citizens, right? They still are connected to you. They're a little bit different than they were in a truly totalitarian regime. And so they might have sympathies, especially since they're drawn from the people, right? The military, I don't know if you even knew this, but like in the last 10 years, there's been a shift in the military. The majority of enlisted men in the military and the majority of officers in the military now identify as Democrats.
Wow.
Yes. So that happened even before Trump got elected. This has been a sort of a gradual shift, and it's because of who goes into the military, right? It tends to be disproportionately people who are poor, people of color, right? People with very limited options. And so there's lots of confounding factors as to why people like from that demographic, right? And people who believe in service, right? People who, right? And people who believe in the Constitution and those kinds of things, and they tend to go into the military, yes?
Is there any breakdown as to the senior officers in their?
Oh, I don't know. Although, now we're getting into the tea leaves here. All right, so I mean, I can be really raw with you guys if you want. So a lot of people who study Latin America have also been interested in the role of the military, right? So I don't have any expertise in the American military, but people who have looked at Latin American militaries, that's where most coups come from. It's from within the military itself, right? So I was talking to my wife the other day, and then later on some other folks. And I hate to use a sort of poli-sci language, but like a non-zero probability, right? It's like it's not zero, but we don't know how high, right? So when you use the military as an instrument of force, as opposed to the police, although even with the police there's risks, you run the risk that some members, some elements of the military don't comply, which we refer to as a mutiny of some kind. And several regimes have fallen when a unit does not comply, right? So Portugal was a fascist regime that was toppled by a company, really almost a battalion, but pretty much a company, right? It was a couple of captains. They did not want to go to Angola, which was Portugal's Vietnam. They were based outside of Lisbon, and they had kind of planned by themselves, woke up in the morning, early in the morning, gathered up their soldiers, and basically said, listen guys, if you're with us, come with us. If not, you got to stay here, and we'll lock you in, under guard. But we're going to go to Lisbon, and we're going to topple the regime. Not even a full battalion. They got in their trucks, and they just drove. And they got there, and they assaulted the presidential palace, and within a few hours, the rest of the army crumbled. Right? So, but more than often they fail. Right? More than often those units will fail. And so you run this risk, then the regime itself runs the risk. The more it sends troops into cities, one of three things could happen. And here's where it gets really bleak. One is the protesters begin firing at the police, right? Or at the forces. And you get the beginnings of a civil war, or at least a conflict of some kind, right? Number two, the forces begin firing at police officers. So, and that has also happened in other cases as well, right? So where you have military forces, let's say, firing against the Chicago City Police, right? They get in a confrontation. Third option is one company decides we don't want to follow your orders, and now what happens, right? And you try to arrest them, well, they have, so the risks are high, and so for civilians, we're not really involved in those things for the most part, right? We're not part of that equation. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, what you're saying is very interesting, and I have this picture in my mind of all those military officers sitting in front of the president, stone-faced.
Yes.
And I think that was really important, at least in where I get news.
Yes.
That picture of
A lot of us were very optimistic when we saw that.
Yes.
And it was very malicious compliance, right? Silent, and as soon as the president or Hegseth was done speaking, attend hut, they all stood up quietly, and then that was it. Like, that was a very clear case, in my opinion, of they did exactly what they gathered like they were told to.
They can
And
be
they did nothing
ordered to
else.
attend a meeting and they must go.
Yes.
They cannot be ordered to respect.
Correct. Correct. And one of the funny things I showed my students the other day, we were looking at Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I do a lot of where my students look at music videos and we analyze them. And I had them look up, what are some other controversies involving this song? And one of the ones was actually during the military parade. The 7th Infantry Division marched to that song, Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater
That was
Revival.
Trump's military?
Yeah.
Someone in that military division chose that song, right? That's interesting, right? So we're at that point now where it's really kind of like reading the tea leaves, like which general, and a lot of generals came out after that event and said like, this is unacceptable, retired, right? It's all been retired officers that have come out and said, but retired officers talk to current officers, right? So, I mean, we're very much in 1980s Latin America, like what is the military doing kind of territory, right? But here's the hopeful part, and I'll end with this because I know I'm probably way over time. Number one is nonviolent resistance tends to be not necessarily effective in toppling regimes, but it doesn't make things worse. Let's put it that way, right? But that it has to be done very, in an organized way, right? So some symbolic acts, right? So colors, silent marches, right? Where you say nothing and you just parade through the streets, candlelight vigils, things that have like a very bizarre kind of impact. In Latin America, a common one, which I began seeing in Washington, D.C., is coming out of your house and just banging your pots and pans. Makes noise, right? But it also symbolically is like there's no food here for us to cook, right? So in Latin America, oftentimes housewives would march, banging their pots and pans, right? As a protest about economic conditions. And again, it's very difficult to shoot a bunch of mothers, right? So you do that. Economic resistance, right? So, your traditional boycotts, using money to support people that you want to support, things like that. Information campaigns, right? So just getting information out to people, letting them know what's happening. Those things are really important. And then really important is cultural protests. Music, humor, those kinds of things become really, really important in those moments, right? Think about the civil rights movement, and you can almost just imagine a soundtrack that goes with it, right? So what is the soundtrack of this moment?
Jimmy Kimmel.
Maybe, right? But yeah, so a lot of the, even some of the pop stars, right? Like Taylor Swift, like has some very, very political commentary in her music, and you find it more in other places too. Some other advice is avoid large static demonstrations, right? So gatherings in one place can be good if you know it's safe, but like it's also makes you a big target, right? So moving, right? Marches are more effective in some ways, or what we call flash mobs, right? There's no reason why you can't use a flash mob for something political rather than just to be silly. And then, what else? Combine offline and online actions to confuse, right? So sometimes, and I've seen this already happening in Chicago, where on Facebook they'd be like, we're meeting at this park, and then they don't. And instead there's a big crowd at a different park. And why? It's because they put it on their Facebook page, but then through Signal or other chats, they distribute it to their members, we're actually meeting here. And so like, all the people show up to stop them there, but instead they're in this other place. And then finally, localize action, right? So small, spaces of resistance in small communities are actually often much, much more effective. It's much easier to convince your mayor to do something, right, than it is to convince, the president to do something. And that's always the case, right? Because it's just a question of numbers, right? Think about the number of people that gathered yesterday. That's almost the number of people that voted in the last mayoral election, right? So that she's paying attention to that if she wants to keep her job. And solving community level, local level problems is often easier, right? There's resources for that. And building these sort of solidarity networks, right? So the folks that I am slightly encouraged, there's a famous house in our neighborhood that has not had its Trump flag for the last 3.5, 4 weeks. And I honestly don't know whether I should be happy or terrified, right? I'm going with happy, so maybe, but finding these little paths, and I did, I'll end with this. One of the things I liked about scouting, first of all, was our ecumenicalism, right? So we had to do services that were very because we have Hindus in our troop and we have people of different faiths and denominations, but that you have to interact with people who have all agreed that they love, the things about scouting, right? The code, right? To be kind and to, be a good citizen, and all those kinds of things, but have different views politically. And learning how to reconcile those things and trying to understand their point of view, but also getting them to realize that, hey, not all Democrats eat babies or whatever, you're told, that we do other kinds of things too, right? Besides eat babies, right? Which I'm joking. But that becomes really, really important, that your neighbor who you disagree with on 20 different issues, you might agree with them on the one that you can get them to come to the event, right? And then maybe they rethink one of their 20, and then you kind of build from there. Or at the very least, they're not going to be eager to report you to the authorities because they think you're a decent person, which is maybe the minimal baseline you can hope for in some of these cases. But yeah, I hope I didn't terrify any of the younger ones. So that's all I have for today. I think you guys, I love this service. Yeah, it's very outside my wheelhouse a little bit, but not entirely. I grew up Baptist and then became Catholic. And we had a nun who danced. She did interpretive dance of scripture passages, right? So I'm a very different kind of Catholic than maybe you're used to. But anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miguel. And I'll echo something from Wendy's stories. Where are you in that story? So I think we're all in there somewhere. We release our flame today with the words of Richard Fuchs. May the light of truth illumine our minds. May the spark of love set our hearts on fire. May the flame of freedom burn brightly within us, now and always. Please rise in body or spirit for hymn number 1024 in the teal hymnal, when the Spirit says do.
So we need to pick our words and figure out how many times we might say it.
All right.
So of course, the
Few
first-
times would be
the
good.
first verse is always with do, and
Okay.
then I think we should do, I'm gonna play it through once, of course.
Yeah.
So I'll play it through a total of 6 times. I think we should do, two do verses at the beginning and the end, and then let's just do dance, laugh, or sing, dance, laugh.
Sing, dance, laugh?
Yes,
Sing.
sing, dance, laugh, do.
Do, sing, dance, laugh, do. Hopefully that'll make sense to you as we go.
All right.
Now our congregational blessing. Go in peace, believe in peace, create peace, be peace. Please join me. Go in peace, believe in peace, create peace, be peace. Thank you, everyone.
Very much.